They tried to scare his family out of their home, but they never expected the father was trained to dismantle terror networks. Garrett Lomax knew something was wrong the moment he saw 3 men step out of a silver Ford Explorer and walk toward his driveway. They weren't police, but they carried themselves like they wanted everyone to think they were. Matching dark polos, tactical belts weighed down with gear, laminated badges clipped to their chests. From a distance, it looked official enough to fool anyone who didn't know better, but Garrett wasn't anyone. He'd spent nearly 20 years spotting men who pretended to be in control when really they were just hiding behind props. "Mr. Lomax," the tallest of them called out, his voice carrying across the quiet street. "We need to talk about that vehicle." Garrett had been cleaning out the back of his truck, an old F-150 that still smelled faintly of motor oil and sawdust. He paused, set the box of tools down, and looked up at the man. His wife, Shanice, was inside with their daughter, Leona, studying for her biology test. His son, Bryson, was shooting hoops with a neighbor kid 2 houses down. Garrett wiped his hands on a rag and asked evenly, "What about it?" "It violates community standards," the man said. He was white, mid-40s, lean, with close-cropped hair. The badge clipped to his chest had the words Neighborhood Compliance Authority in bold letters. But Garrett noticed the seal was generic. No county emblem, no city stamp. Just an image of a tree and some stars. "Since when does the HOA have authority to dictate what I drive?" Garrett asked. His voice stayed level, but inside a switch had flipped. He'd heard tone like this before, condescending, designed to establish control. The man smirked. "We've had complaints. Trucks like that don't belong parked out here, not in a community like this." His buddies chuckled behind him, one crossing his arms, the other shifting his weight like he was getting ready for something. Garrett studied them quietly. "Complaints from who?" "That's confidential," the man replied, stepping closer. "But we'll need it moved. You can park it outside the subdivision if you like. Otherwise, you'll face penalties." Garrett almost laughed, but he didn't. He wasn't about to give them the satisfaction. Instead, he tilted his head slightly. "Penalties from who?" "Last I checked, compliance officers don't carry handcuffs or fake badges." That line landed harder than the men expected. The smirk dropped for a moment, replaced by a flash of irritation. The leader quickly recovered. "Watch yourself, Mr. Lomax. We don't want to escalate things." Before Garrett could respond, the front door opened. Shanice stepped out holding a mug of tea, her face calm but her eyes sharp. "What's going on?" she asked, scanning the 3 strangers with a mix of caution and disgust. "Ma'am, nothing you need to worry about," the leader said smoothly. "Just making sure your family follows the rules." "It's for everyone's safety." Shanice raised an eyebrow. "Safety? From a pickup truck?" The 2 men behind the leader laughed openly this time, one of them muttering under his breath, "More like safety from him." Garrett heard it clearly. Every muscle in his body wanted to react, but he forced himself still. Years of training had taught him control, that the first move you made in situations like this determined how far things went. He looked directly at the man who'd muttered and asked in a low, steady voice, "What did you just say?" The man shifted uncomfortably but didn't repeat it. The leader quickly waved it off. "Enough. Mr. Lomax, you've been warned. We'll be back to check. Don't make us take further action." They turned as if they'd just issued an official order, climbed back into their SUV, and drove off slowly, letting the moment hang in the air. Garrett watched the Explorer disappear around the corner before speaking. "Shanice," he said quietly, "those men weren't from the HOA." "I figured as much," she replied, sipping her tea like her hands weren't shaking slightly. "So what are they?" Garrett exhaled through his nose, eyes still locked on the street. "Trouble. Organized, too. They weren't improvising. They've done this before." Bryson jogged up with a basketball tucked under his arm. "Dad, who were those guys?" "They looked like cops." "They weren't cops," Garrett said firmly. "And I'll explain more later. For now, I just want you and your sister to stay alert. Don't talk to them if they come back." The weight of his words settled in. Shanice met his gaze, and though she wanted reassurance, Garrett couldn't give it yet. His instincts screamed that this was just the beginning. But what Garrett didn't know was that this group wasn't finished. They were just testing the waters, waiting to see how far they could push his family. Dinner that night felt different. Normally, the Lomax household was filled with the noise of conversation, Bryson going on about basketball drills, Leona sharing facts from her science textbooks, Shanice gently reminding Garrett not to over-season the chicken. But this evening, the words hung shorter, heavier, like everyone was waiting for him to say something that would explain away the strange encounter in the driveway. The kitchen light cast a soft glow over the table. Plates were half finished, forks scraped occasionally, and every few minutes Shanice's eyes drifted toward the front window. Garrett noticed each glance, though she tried to hide it. Finally, Leona broke the silence. "Daddy, why did those men sound like they were in charge if they weren't real officers?" Garrett set down his fork. He'd been expecting the question, because that's what they wanted you to believe. People who want control usually pretend to have more power than they do. It's the first trick in the book. Bryson frowned, twirling his fork in his mashed potatoes. "So they're fakes? Like straight-up criminals?" "Not just fakes," Garrett replied. "They're organized. They dress the part, act the part, and hope folks don't ask questions. Most people won't. Most people will just back down." Shanice leaned forward, her tone sharper. "But they didn't just come here to talk about the truck. You saw the way they looked at you, like they'd already made up their minds about us." Garrett met her eyes. "I know. And that's why we need to stay sharp." He didn't elaborate, but his family had seen enough of his moods to recognize when his instincts were speaking louder than his words. For years, Garrett had been the steady anchor, the calm presence no matter what life threw at them. But Shanice remembered the missions he never talked about, the long stretches where his phone was off and he came back with shadows in his eyes. She knew when his guard was up. Leona's fork clinked against her plate. "Are they going to come back?" "Yes," Garrett said plainly. "They will," Shanice gave him a look. "You sound sure." "I am," he said. "Because people like that don't test you once and walk away. They're watching how we respond. They're figuring out how far they can push." The room went quiet again. Bryson shifted in his seat, uncomfortable with the weight of the conversation. "What do we do then? Just wait for them?" Garrett leaned back, folding his arms. His voice was calm but firm. "We live our lives. You go to school. You play your games. Your mom runs her day the way she always does, and I'll handle them when the time comes. But Dad—" Garrett's tone cut just enough to halt Bryson mid-sentence. "That's not up for debate. Your job is to stay safe, not to worry about what I'll do." Shanice placed her hand on Garrett's arm, steady but questioning. "You're not thinking of starting something, are you? Because that's exactly what they want, to provoke you." Garrett glanced at her. "I won't start anything, but I also won't let them think this house is an easy target." The silence after that was heavier, but it wasn't hopeless. It was preparation. Each member of the family adjusting to the reality that their quiet street wasn't as safe as they'd believed. After dinner, Garrett stepped outside alone. The night air was cool, carrying the faint sound of crickets. He stood on the porch, arms crossed, scanning the street the way he used to scan ridge lines overseas. Every car that passed, every porch light flickering on, every shadow moving behind curtains, it all registered. Shanice came out after a few minutes, wrapping a sweater tighter around herself. "You're doing that thing again," she said softly. He didn't look away from the street. "What thing?" "The thing where you're not here with me. You're somewhere else. Somewhere you don't talk about." Finally, he turned to face her, his voice lowered. "I can't help it, Shan. When something feels wrong, I see patterns. I notice the small things. That's how I kept my team alive all those years." "And what about now?" she asked. "How do you keep us safe without dragging us into your old world?" Garrett studied her face, the worry hidden behind her strength. "By staying 2 steps ahead, by knowing what's coming before they do." She let out a long breath, looking down at the porch boards. "I don't want the kids growing up scared every time a car slows in front of the house." "They won't," Garrett said. "Because I'll end this before it gets that far." For a moment, neither spoke. The street was still, save for the occasional bark of a dog a few houses away. Garrett placed a hand on her shoulder. "Trust me, I've seen people like this before. They don't expect resistance, and they sure don't expect someone like me." Shanice looked at him closely, as if trying to read the parts of him he never said out loud. Finally, she gave a small nod. They went back inside, but the atmosphere had shifted. Everyone in the house understood that what happened earlier wasn't just a strange run-in. It was the first sign of a storm. But Garrett didn't realize yet that the neighbors were watching too, and their silence was about to speak louder than words. The next morning, Garrett left early to take Bryson to basketball practice at the YMCA. As he pulled out of the driveway, he caught sight of two of his neighbors standing across the street. Both of them paused mid-conversation when they noticed him, pretending to adjust their mail or check a phone. He knew the look well, people who wanted to say something but didn't have the courage to speak. When he got back, Shanice was in the yard tending to her small row of hydrangeas. A few houses down, Mrs. Callahan, an older woman with a small terrier, froze when she saw Shanice. She gave a tight smile, then tugged the dog back inside as if she had somewhere important to be. It was almost noon. Garrett didn't miss the timing. Inside the house, Leona was at the dining room table flipping through her notes. "Mom," she said, "people are acting weird. When I was walking back from school, Mrs. Keating didn't wave. She always waves." Shanice glanced at Garrett, her lips pressing into a line. "You think they know something?" Garrett's tone was measured. "They don't know anything. They're just scared." "Easier to stay quiet than to stand up," Leona frowned. "But why would they be scared of men pretending to be the HOA? Garrett hesitated before answering. "Because deep down they know it isn't the HOA. They know it's something worse. And if they acknowledge it, they'd have to do something about it." That afternoon, as Garrett wheeled the trash bins down the driveway, his neighbor Don Avery pulled up in his SUV. Garrett had spoken to Don a few times, enough to exchange polite nods, not much else. Today, though, Don rolled down his window. "Garrett," he said, voice low, "can I give you some advice?" Garrett stopped, one hand still on the bin handle. "Go ahead. Those guys that came by yesterday..." Don looked around before continuing. "They've been here before, not just to you. A couple months ago, they showed up at the Hernandez house down on Millbrook. Said their porch furniture wasn't approved. Scared the life out of them. Next thing you know, they put the house up for sale." Garrett raised an eyebrow. "And nobody reported it?" Don shook his head. "Most folks around here don't want trouble. The HOA doesn't deny it's them, and the cops don't get involved unless there's violence, so people just let it go." "Let it go," Garrett repeated, the words tasting bitter. "And now they're stronger for it." Don sighed. "Look, man, I'm just telling you, don't push back too hard. They'll make your life hell. They can find ways to pressure people. It's not worth it." Garrett's eyes narrowed, his voice flat. "It's always worth it when your family's being targeted." Don gave a half shrug, like he'd already said too much, then rolled the window up and drove away. That evening, Shanice sat on the edge of their bed while Garrett laced up his running shoes. "You're not really surprised the neighbors didn't say anything, are you?" she asked. "No," Garrett admitted. "I've seen it before. Overseas, back home, doesn't matter. People see wrong, they look away. They convince themselves it's not their fight." "And what about us?" Shanice pressed. "What happens when it is our fight and nobody wants to stand with us?" Garrett looked at her steadily. "Then I stand. That's enough." Later, when the kids had gone upstairs, Shanice found herself staring out the living room window. Across the street, a curtain shifted in the Reynolds house. She caught a glimpse of someone peeking through the blinds before the fabric fell back into place. Watching. Always watching. The silence of the neighbors was louder than words. It meant they'd seen this happen before. It meant they knew the pattern but didn't dare interfere. And now their silence had put the spotlight firmly on the Lomax family. As Garrett stepped outside for his late run, he glanced at the houses lined neatly along the street. He could feel the eyes behind the windows measuring him, waiting to see if he'd bend like the others. But Garrett wasn't built to bend. And while he thought the neighbor's silence was cowardice, he was about to learn it also gave the fake officers room to escalate their tactics without resistance. 2 days later, the Ford Explorer showed up again. Same vehicle, same trio of men, but this time they didn't bother with the polite act. They parked directly in front of the Lomax driveway, blocking Garrett's truck. Shanice was unloading groceries from the back seat when the men climbed out. The leader, Garrett had started calling him Clipboard in his head, since he always carried one, walked up with a smirk. "Mrs. Lomax," Clipboard said, his voice too smooth to be genuine. "We told your husband about the violations. Looks like nothing's changed. That's a problem." Shanice straightened her shoulders, bags of produce still in her arms. "What problem?" "My husband already told you your authority doesn't mean anything here." Clipboard glanced at his partners, then stepped closer. "It means more than you think. Families who don't comply usually regret it." That was when Garrett came out of the house, still in his running shorts, sweat drying on his t-shirt. He didn't rush, he didn't bark. He simply walked up, placed the bag of garbage he'd been carrying into the bin, and then turned to face them. "You're back," he said evenly. Clipboard smirked. "We said we'd check. Looks like your truck hasn't moved. Neither has the decor in your backyard. You're stacking up fines, Mr. Lomax." Garrett's eyes flicked to the clipboard. He noticed the paper on it wasn't official. It was a generic form with blanks filled in by pen. The seal in the corner was a cheap printout. He almost pitied them. "Almost. You really need better props," Garrett said quietly. Clipboard's smirk faltered. "Excuse me?" "You heard me. That seal is from a stock image. Your badge clips don't match. And one of your guys is wearing a belt with gear that doesn't even fit. If you're going to pretend, at least put some effort into it." The shorter man in the group shifted, clearly caught off guard. Clipboard forced a chuckle. "Think you're clever, huh? Let me explain something. People here respect authority. They don't question it. That's why you're the only one giving us trouble." Garrett tilted his head slightly. "Or maybe everyone else figured paying you off was easier than standing their ground. That sound about right?" The taller man in the back stepped forward now, his tone darker. "Careful how you talk to us." Garrett's voice didn't rise. "Or what? You'll give me a fake citation? Scare my wife with empty threats? You've already shown your hand." The air grew tense. Shanice, still holding a grocery bag, looked from one face to another. "You need to leave. Right now." Clipboard ignored her, focusing on Garrett. "You think you're tougher than us because of that army past of yours. Word gets around. People talk." Garrett's jaw didn't move, but his eyes locked onto Clipboard with a sharpness that made the man hesitate. "If you know my past, then you know exactly why this is a mistake." The silence that followed was suffocating. Clipboard tried to hold his ground, but Garrett's stare didn't waver. It wasn't aggression, it was calculation. The same look that had broken men much harder than these pretenders. Finally, Clipboard looked away. "Fine, have it your way. But we'll be back, and you'll wish you'd listened." They turned and walked back to the Explorer, slamming the doors harder than necessary. The SUV rumbled to life and sped down the street. Shanice let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She set the groceries down on the hood of the car and looked at her husband. "Garrett, what are you doing?" "You're provoking them?" "No," Garrett said softly, watching the taillights vanish. "I'm showing them I see through them." "That's the only language men like that understand." Bryson had been watching from the upstairs window. He came down the stairs quickly, his voice full of nervous energy. "Dad, you stared them down like in the movies." "They looked scared." Garrett shook his head. "They weren't scared, just rattled. But rattled men are dangerous men. That means the next time they come back, they won't waste time talking." Leona, who had been listening from the hallway, whispered, "So what happens next?" Garrett looked at his children, then at Shanice. "Next, I start paying closer attention. I start learning their patterns. Because men like this, they always have patterns. And patterns can be broken." Later that night, when the house was quiet, Garrett sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad. He wrote down everything he'd observed. The make and model of the SUV, the partial license plate, the order they stood in, the phrases they repeated, the inconsistencies in their gear. His handwriting was neat, methodical, like he was back writing mission reports. Shanice came downstairs and stood in the doorway. "You're not letting this go, are you?" Garrett didn't look up. "Would you?" She crossed her arms, watching him. "No, but I'd be afraid." "I still am." Garrett finally met her eyes. "Fear keeps you alert. Panic gets you killed. We'll be fine, Shan, as long as I stay 2 steps ahead." But Garrett was about to learn that these men weren't freelancing. They were part of something bigger, and their next move would prove just how far they were willing to go. The following Saturday morning, Garrett decided to mow the lawn. He wanted things to look normal for the kids, for Shanice, for the neighbors who were still pretending nothing was wrong. But halfway through pushing the mower across the front yard, the Explorer rolled past again, slow, deliberate, like a shark circling its prey. Garrett cut the engine, wiped his forehead, and watched as the SUV parked 3 houses down. Clipboard and his 2 sidekicks stepped out, this time without clipboards or papers. No pretense of paperwork, just presence. Shanice came to the front porch, arms folded tight across her chest. "Garrett," she called, her voice edged with warning. "I see them," he replied calmly. Clipboard shouted from down the street, "Beautiful day for compliance checks, don't you think?" His tone was mocking now, stripped of the fake professionalism. Garrett walked toward the sidewalk, steady and unhurried. "You keep showing up," he said, voice carrying. "But you're not fooling anyone." Clipboard grinned. "We don't need to fool anyone. Folks around here know better than to cross us." That was when Mrs. Callahan, the woman with the terrier, peeked out from her front door. She froze as soon as she realized both Garrett and the men saw her. Clipboard tipped an imaginary hat her way, and she quickly shut the door. Garrett caught it all, his mind clicking like a camera. Fear in the neighbors. Confidence in the impostors. That meant leverage. These men thrived on silence. "You ever notice," Garrett said slowly, "that real authority doesn't need to prove itself? It doesn't need to circle houses, block driveways, or bark at women carrying groceries. Real authority speaks once, and it's respected. What you've got is theater, cheap theater," the shorter man bristled, stepping closer. "You think you're smarter than us, don't you?" Garrett tilted his head slightly. "No, I think you're sloppy. Your badges don't match. Your vehicle has a dent on the passenger side that wasn't there last week, which means you're not invincible. You make mistakes." Clipboard's grin faltered again. He glanced at his partners, annoyed at their lack of composure, then looked back at Garrett, trying to regain control. "We don't make mistakes. We make examples." Shanice stepped off the porch, her voice sharp now. "Leave before I call the real police," Clipboard chuckled. "And tell them what? That some neighbors care about how the street looks. Good luck with that." Garrett took a slow step forward. His tone stayed even, but there was steel in it now. "Try me, because I've already got enough to bury this charade. The only question is how much longer you want to play this game before it falls apart." For the first time, the tall man in the back spoke. His voice was deep, gravelly. "You don't know who you're messing with." Garrett's eyes locked on his. "Neither do you." The tension was electric, a standoff on a suburban street with curtains twitching in the background. The neighbors were watching, but no one dared step outside. Clipboard finally signaled to his men, and they backed toward the Explorer. "We'll be back," Clipboard said, his tone promising escalation. "I'm counting on it," Garrett replied. The SUV pulled away, leaving behind silence that felt heavier than their presence. Shanice turned to him, her voice low but firm. "Garrett, you're pushing them. What if they bring more people next time?" Garrett looked at her. "Then I'll be ready for more people." That night, he pulled out his old military notebooks, the ones he hadn't touched in years. He flipped through pages of field notes, tactical diagrams, even communication codes. Bryson wandered into the kitchen, eyes widening at the sight of the old weathered pages. "Dad, are you planning something?" Garrett closed the notebook slowly. "I'm preparing." "There's a difference." "But Mom says—" "Your mom's right to be worried," Garrett interrupted gently. "But here's the truth. When you let bullies run unchecked, they don't stop. They get bolder, and if you want peace, sometimes you have to stand firm." Leona had followed her brother in. She crossed her arms, watching her father closely. "What if standing firm makes them hurt us?" Garrett leaned back in his chair, studying both of them. "That's why I don't just stand, I plan. I look for their cracks, and today I saw plenty of them." Shanice entered quietly, her eyes moving from the notebooks to Garrett's face. "You're not just planning, Garrett. You're already fighting." He didn't deny it. He just said, "Someone has to." But Garrett was about to realize that the fight wasn't just with the imposters. It was also with his own past, the parts of himself he thought he'd left behind. That night, Garrett couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the faint glow of the digital clock washing the room in green. Every creak of the house, every car passing outside triggered the part of his brain that refused to shut off. Shanice slept beside him, but even in her rest, she stirred often, as if her body understood there was a storm brewing outside their walls. Around 3 a.m., Garrett gave up on sleep and went downstairs. He poured a glass of water, sat at the kitchen table, and let the silence press in. Memories he usually kept buried started to surface. He remembered Kandahar 12 years ago. His team had been pinned down in a compound, outnumbered, outgunned. He could still hear the static on the radio, the sound of Sergeant Ruiz gasping after shrapnel tore through his vest. Garrett had been the one to stay calm, to find the weak point in the enemy's formation. He led his men out that night with precision and cold focus. That same focus was stirring now, here in suburban Charlotte. Only this wasn't Afghanistan. It was his neighborhood, his family, and the enemy wasn't a militia. It was 3 men with badges they bought online. Still, the pattern was the same. Identify, observe, exploit, eliminate the threat. The sound of soft footsteps pulled him out of his thoughts. Bryson stood at the bottom of the stairs in pajama pants, rubbing his eyes. "Dad, you're up again?" Garrett forced a small smile. "Couldn't sleep." "What are you doing awake?" "Had a dream," Bryson said quietly. "I dreamed those guys came back, but this time they had more trucks." Garrett motioned for him to sit. "Dreams don't hurt you. They just remind you of what you're worried about." Bryson sat across from him. "You weren't scared out there the other day?" "Not even a little." "How do you do that?" Garrett leaned forward. "You think I wasn't scared? I was. I just don't let it control me. Fear's normal. It's what you do with it that matters." Bryson looked down at his hands. "So what do we do? Just wait for them?" "No," Garrett said firmly. "We prepare. We stay alert. And when the time comes, we act." Before Bryson could ask more, Shanice appeared at the top of the stairs, her robe pulled tight. "Both of you should be sleeping," she said softly. Bryson shuffled upstairs, leaving Garrett and Shanice in the kitchen. She walked over, touched his shoulder, and looked at the open notebook filled with scribbles. "You're going back," she whispered. Garrett frowned. "Back to that place in your head. The one you never talk about. The one you left behind when you came home." He didn't answer. She sat down next to him, her eyes steady. "I know you, Garrett. You think you can just flip that switch again, but it changes you. It makes you someone else." "Maybe that's what I need right now," he muttered. "No," Shanice said firmly. "What we need is you. Not Commander Lomax, not the man who lived off adrenaline and silence. Just you, the husband, the father." Her words cut through, but Garrett couldn't deny the truth. The men outside weren't going away, and every instinct he had told him this would escalate. If he didn't use what he knew, they could lose more than a truck or backyard furniture. The next day, Garrett made his first move. He drove to a hardware store in Rock Hill and bought a set of small cameras, ones that could be mounted under eaves and tucked in corners of windows. When he returned, he installed them quietly, his movements precise. Shanice watched from the porch, arms crossed. Not stopping him, but not approving either. "More reminders that we're not safe," she said under her breath. "Reminders that we're prepared," Garrett corrected. Later that evening, Garrett got a call from an old contact, Detective Miles Renner, a man he'd worked with years back on a joint training exercise. They hadn't spoken in ages, but when Garrett explained what was happening, Renner didn't hesitate. "Send me everything you've got," Renner said. "Plates, photos, patterns. I'll run them through our system, see what shakes loose." Hanging up, Garrett felt the faintest sense of control returning. It wasn't much, but it was movement, and movement mattered. Shanice caught the look in his eyes. "You've already started a war, haven't you?" Garrett exhaled slowly. "I didn't start it, but I'll finish it." He stepped outside into the evening air, scanning the street as if it were a battlefield. Curtains still twitched, neighbors still stayed silent, and somewhere beyond the trees, the men in the Explorer were already planning their next move. But the next time they came, they wouldn't just test Garrett, they'd target Shanice directly, and that would push everything into dangerous territory. He walked the perimeter of the house twice, noting sightlines, shadows, potential blind spots. His movements were precise, almost surgical. Shanice watched from the porch, arms crossed. "You're not just protecting us anymore," she said softly. "You're hunting them." Garrett paused. "Hunting means anger. I'm not angry, I'm patient. That's the difference." But deep down, he knew anger was simmering just beneath the surface. At 2:07 a.m., the cameras caught the Explorer again. This time the SUV slowed to a crawl and one of the men got out. He walked right up to the edge of the Lomax property, looked straight into one of the cameras and grinned before getting back into the vehicle. The footage was chilling. Garrett replayed it 3 times, studying the man's face, every angle of his posture. They weren't hiding anymore. They wanted him to know they were watching. Shanice sat beside him, eyes wide. "They're taunting us." Garrett leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Good, that means they're confident. And confident men make mistakes." But Garrett didn't realize their confidence wasn't just bravado, because the very next move would shift from intimidation to confrontation, and the truth about the scam would finally start coming to light. Saturday came like a held breath. The weather was clear, but the tension over the Lomax house was heavy enough to touch. Garrett had been up since dawn, checking the camera feeds, reviewing notes, and running through the plan he'd built with Detective Renner over the past 3 days. Every detail was ready. If the men came back, the evidence would lock them down by noon. Shanice was folding laundry in the living room when she heard Garrett on the phone. His voice was low but urgent. "Miles, they're circling again. Plates confirmed." Renner's voice on the other end came through clear. "Got a hit." Same SUV linked to at least 4 compliance incidents in other neighborhoods across York County. Families report harassment, intimidation, forced property sales. These guys aren't freelancers, they're a crew, probably contractors hired to push people out of their homes. Garrett's eyes narrowed. "So it's a real operation?" Renner didn't hesitate. "Bigger than you think. My guess they're working with a shadow property group, the kind that buys undervalued homes through shell companies, flips them fast, and disappears. We've been trying to catch them in the act. You might have just given me the chance." Garrett hung up and turned to Shanice. "We've got them. Now we just need them to step on the trap." "Trap?" Shanice repeated, folding a shirt slowly. "I've set the cameras to stream live to Renner's team. If they cross onto the property tonight, it's trespassing. If they threaten us, it's criminal harassment. With enough evidence, they'll be arrested before they can even blink." Shanice's hands shook slightly. "And what if they don't care about being arrested? What if they're desperate?" Garrett placed a hand on her shoulder. "Then they'll learn what desperation feels like when it's turned back on them." That evening, Garrett parked his truck at the edge of the driveway and left. The garage door opened just enough to give himself a line of sight to the street. The kids stayed upstairs with the television on low. Shanice sat near the window with her phone ready. Every movement outside drew Garrett's eyes. At 9:47 p.m., the Explorer returned. It rolled to a stop directly in front of the house, engine idling. Clipboard stepped out first, his face harder now, the smirk gone. The 2 others followed, one holding a flashlight, the other with a thick envelope in his hand. Garrett stepped out from the garage, his hands at his sides. Clipboard raised his voice. "Evening, Mr. Lomax. We're here to serve notice. This is your last warning before we take action." Garrett said nothing. Clipboard continued. "You've ignored citations, refused compliance, and interfered with our process. That's obstruction." "You're not an authority," Garrett said evenly. "And that's trespassing." The man with the envelope tossed it onto the driveway. "Sign or else." Shanice's phone recorded from the window, the footage streaming live to Renner's team. Garrett took a slow step forward. "Or else what?" Clipboard grinned darkly. "Or else we make you move. Like all the others." Garrett's voice dropped to a cold calm. "You picked the wrong family." In the distance, faint but growing, the sound of sirens cut through the night. Clipboard's eyes flicked toward the street corners, uncertainty flashing for the first time. "What did you do?" he demanded. "Invited friends," Garrett said simply. 2 unmarked cars rolled up, lights flashing. Renner stepped out of the lead vehicle, badge on display. "Hands where we can see them!" he barked. Clipboard's smirk collapsed. The man with the flashlight dropped it to the pavement. The taller man froze, eyes darting between Garrett and the approaching officers. Renner strode forward. "You're under investigation for multiple counts of harassment, trespassing, and fraud. We've got statements, video, and records linking you to property scams across 3 counties. Congratulations, you're done." Clipboard tried to bluster. "We're contractors. We've got fake IDs, fake citations, and a fake authority no one recognizes," Renner cut in. "It's over." The officers moved in, cuffing the men one by one. Clipboard shot Garrett a look full of venom. "You think this stops anything? You're just a mark. You don't know how deep this goes." Garrett didn't move, his voice still quiet. "Deeper than you, but it starts with you." As the Explorer was searched, more evidence came to light. Blank citations, forged HOA letters, a list of targeted families with addresses and property values. Renner's team cataloged everything, bagging it as evidence. Shanice came outside, standing next to Garrett as the men were led to the cars. "It's over?" she asked softly. Garrett looked at her. "This chapter is," Renner approached, clapping Garrett lightly on the shoulder. "You just gave us the break we needed. With what we found tonight, we can roll up the whole operation." Garrett nodded once. "Good. No one else should have to go through this." The street was quiet again, but not the same kind of quiet. Neighbors began opening their doors, stepping onto porches for the first time. People were looking at Garrett not with avoidance, but with something like respect and maybe guilt. But Garrett knew the arrests weren't the end. There was still a reckoning coming, not just for the men in handcuffs, but for the neighborhood that had stayed silent until now. The flashing lights faded from the street an hour later. The Explorer was gone, hauled off on a tow truck. Clipboard and his men sat cuffed in the back of police cars, shouting empty threats that nobody cared to hear. For the first time in weeks, Garrett's driveway stood clear. But inside the Lomax house, the air was still charged, the weight of what had just happened pressing on everyone's shoulders. Shanice closed the curtains slowly. "It feels quiet," she whispered. "Too quiet." Garrett was sitting at the table, the same table he'd been mapping patterns on for days. His notepad lay open, filled with details and sketches. He pushed it aside, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "That's not the silence of intimidation anymore. That's relief. The kind you get after a fight's been won." Upstairs, Bryson and Leona came down cautiously, both of them wide-eyed. "Are they gone?" Leona asked. "They're gone," Garrett said firmly. "And they won't be back." Bryson let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "You stared them down, Dad. You didn't even raise your voice. You just controlled it." Garrett nodded. "That's what you do when someone wants to scare you. You don't feed their performance. You make them face the truth." Later that night, after the kids went to bed, Shanice sat with Garrett on the porch. The street was unusually alive, neighbors trickling out, whispering among themselves. Some glanced over at the Lomax house, shame in their eyes. Others crossed the street and offered awkward words. "Garrett," Mrs. Callahan said timidly, clutching her terrier's leash. "I'm sorry. I should have spoken up sooner. I was afraid." Garrett looked at her, his expression unreadable at first, then softened. Fear's natural. But silence gives men like that power. "Next time, speak. Not for me, for yourself." One by one, others echoed similar words. Don Avery came last, guilt heavy in his voice. "You were right. I should have stood with you earlier. I let them win by staying quiet." Garrett didn't gloat, didn't lecture. He simply said, "Now you know better. Don't let it happen again, not here, not anywhere." Shanice glanced at him as the neighbors slowly dispersed. "You think they'll listen?" "They will," Garrett said, "because they've seen what silence costs." Days later, the news spread. Local papers reported the arrests, detailing the fraudulent scheme of fake HOA enforcers who had terrorized families across multiple counties. Garrett's name wasn't in the articles, but the families who had been targeted knew who had forced the truth into daylight. Renner called him that week. "We're rolling up the bigger fish. Your footage gave us the missing link. This operation is finished." Garrett only said good and hung up. He wasn't looking for thanks. He'd done what needed to be done. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the street in gold, Garrett sat on the porch with Bryson and Leona. He leaned back, hands folded, letting the moment breathe. "Dad," Bryson said, "were you scared? Like, really scared?" Garrett thought about it, then answered honestly, "Yeah, fear is not weakness. It's a reminder to respect the situation. What matters is whether you let it control you." Leona tilted her head. "So what's the lesson?" Garrett smiled faintly. That when people try to intimidate you, when they puff their chest and pretend they've got power, they only win if you let them. Stand firm. Ask questions. Don't give in to silence, because silence is how bullies grow. Shanice came out with 3 glasses of iced tea, setting them down on the table. "And maybe," she added, "the lesson is that sometimes the scariest battles aren't overseas. They're right here in our neighborhoods, hidden behind fake authority." Garrett nodded. "That too." The kids sipped their tea, listening carefully. The night felt lighter, safer. But Garrett knew it wasn't the end of the story. Evil didn't disappear. It just found new disguises. Still, for his family, for his street, for now, it was enough. As the porch light flicked on and the neighborhood settled into the calm of evening, Garrett glanced at his children once more. "Remember this," he said quietly. "You don't need to be loud to be strong. You don't need to fight with fists to win a battle. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stand still and not give ground." He let the words hang in the air, letting them absorb the weight. And for the first time in weeks, the Lomax family felt like their home truly belonged to them again. The moral is simple. Bullies thrive when good people stay silent. Speak up, stand your ground, and protect what matters, because strength isn't in intimidation, it's in resilience. If you've been with me through this story, don't forget to subscribe for more, because stories like this remind us why vigilance, courage, and family matter most.